Okay, so as with some of my other basic breakdown videos, I'm going to show you a shader that I've put together. It's not really a tutorial. I'll explain some of how it works, and I'll show you every node that's in it, how that goes together, but I'm not going to explain every tiny little detail, so have your pause button ready if you want to rebuild the shader. This is one fire shader that has been broken into two different instances, so I have two different results. So the settings that I've broken down allow me to do multiple flames across one sphere, or take one sphere and turn it into a candle flame. I have control over things like amount of flicker, whether it responds to its own normals or world space or a blend of the two. Various different things all kind of kicked into one overall shader, so it can be multi-purpose. So the initial part of the shader looks like this, which is relatively dense, and that's because there's lots of different little things that go into it. So starting off, I wanted to work with this in sort of world space, so I have a setup here that allows for absolute world positioning, so I'm making a triplanar version of this texture. This also means that if I drag it anywhere in space, it's going to reveal sort of a different portion of the overall pattern. So I have the absolute world positioning and then an actual scale, and that just establishes texture scale. And then we have some offsets that are in here, and these offsets are used for creating a normal map a little bit later. So typically speaking, they do nothing, but when you want an offset, you can do that. Another reason why you can use the offset also is to allow yourself to put something in the same place but offset it a little bit, as I did with this, where I have two spheres, one kind of a little bit up and back, and I did an offset in order to get some additional flames. So with this, I didn't have full coverage, so I put two of them together in order to get a little bit more extra, a few extra smaller flames in there. So they'll go back into this make float, which is my world space with offset ability. The next portion is the four-way motion chaos. If you've downloaded the ocean example that's available from the marketplace, it's free, part of their learning setup, you'll see something along this line with the four-way motion chaos, and I'm just using a texture here that I found, but it's pretty easy to make. It's just a series of circles, and it just happens to be seamless. I may remake my own if I decide to change it, and I'm actually using it kind of inverted because it creates sort of like a Voronoi pattern. So I have one of each of these, so it's the exact same set of nodes 3 times, each one of them coming from this. And they're all feeding into their individual lerp nodes into the B, and coming off of this. What this is I'm masking off the information. So when I created each one of these projections, because I'm not using a world space texture node because of the pain in the butt behind it, because you have to use texture objects, etc., if you want to use the functions, I'm basically rebuilding it here, and I'm using vector world space to control where the top and the bottom is, the two sides, and the front and back. And so masking those things off to display each copy of the texture. So the front and back, the sides, and the top and bottom. So that's all this is. And it's just a combination of different things. I'm grabbing the top and running it through a power of 2 just to shorten its distance. You can make it a sharper or a softer transition. So this is just transitioning it, and then this is inverting it so that I get the bottom as well, and I combine them together. So when I view this, I have top and bottom. Otherwise, normally speaking, this would give you a top, but then this would be in the negative space. So it would be in negative values, so 0 would be kind of midline. So in order to get a mask that does both top and bottom with the same texture, that's what I needed to do. And then they're just all added together to make the different sections. So this texture, front and side, top, bottom, etc. Add, you get the whole thing covered. That is going down into an invert. So it's 1 minus the values that are there, which basically puts it into the other range. And that just gives me more of like a Voronoi kind of look to it. But it's a very soft Voronoi because of the way that this texture is. So where it's black, it would be white, and that's the pattern that I'm getting. And then I have a power node just to shorten it. Often cases when you flip or invert any black and white images inside of Unreal, it tends to not look quite the same. So often you need to do something about it, and I'm just putting a power of 10 against it, which then goes into this lerp. We also have taking from our world space information, which is coming off these different masks. So this is green and blue, which would be Y and Z, X and Z, and X and Y for controlling the projections, because you need 2 axes to work with a texture projection. So each one is one of those axes. And those are going into, each one is going into an individual panner. I have an overall speed that I've applied to it, but everything runs off a main speed. And I found that the 4-way motion chaos traveled at a different speed than the panners did. And so I'm multiplying it by 0.1, and I'm also making sure that this is a 2 vector, so that 0.1 is making sure that it only goes up. So this additional texture only goes up. And this texture comes from that ocean shader example, again, that I mentioned before with the 4-way motion chaos. And it's medium waves, I believe, is the one that I chose. Yeah, so medium waves. So it has a lot of interesting breakup, and it happens to have peaks in it. So again, that kind of look. And these are blended with these normals again, the same process as before. So just as I did here, it's exact same thing happening here. And so, you know, front, back, side to side, up and down, and then all added together, and they're added 50-50. So this is just a basic lerp that is having half of the 4-way motion chaos and half of the other one. Having this upward motion consistently gives that feeling of upward drafts coming from it. So that's why I have that. So coming off the blue here, I'm using this to control height information, to get a height gradient. So I pulled it off of that information there, and I'm using it to get a projected height that goes straight through the entire object. And then I have this control, which determines how much of that gradient area it covers. And this allows me to shorten the height of the fire. So in the case of the candle flame, the bottom half of the sphere is invisible, and you see it fade into this region here, and that's because of this setting here. So it's a quick way of getting a gradient which is working from front back at all times. This is the thing, is that any object that I bring in, it's always going to be aligned so it's flowing upwards. So that's what this is. It's just providing me a gradient which is not texture based and is projected. Then I have this control, which is going between having the gradient and not having the gradient. So one controls the scale of the gradient, while the other one controls if the gradient is even there or has any impact. So lerps are really great for kind of feeding that information in and out. And it looks like I have an orphaned value from something else that I had done before, so I'm just going to eliminate that. This is something that I found that I had to use a make float in order to get this to respond the way that I wanted it to, with X, Y, and Z. I don't know what the deal was. I think it's because breaking it apart and putting it back together again, etc. I wanted to make sure all the values were even, so I put it back through this just to sort of clean that up. And this is an overall intensity of this, so it's more kind of like, again, a fall off. It makes the darker regions darker and the bright regions bright, so that's what that power is there for. And this is all multiplied against that gradient, so that the gradient will remove the dark regions but keep the other regions. And it's finally clamped to a 0 to 1 range and put in there. This was something that I was going to use, but then I decided to do it elsewhere. And that's it, so that's that one. Then for the fire, my goodness. So the fire uses that. There it is initially, and so I've created a series of values to use, and some of them are being reused down here, repeating these ones, and these ones only needed one unique control, which was the offset. So they only needed the speed from the original set and the scale from the original set to control the speed and the scale of the texture. And then this offset was something that I manually adjusted to get a result that I liked, although I could have made it a parameter if I wanted to. And these all feed down into this, which is a value of red and a dot product coming from each one of them. So essentially, this one's offset up, this one's no offset, and this one's offset side to get my RGB information, to get a normal map off of it. So it's been fed into here. This arrangement comes from the build normal map from height map, and I just eliminated some of the nodes that I didn't need. So you can see how it's set up here. It's 8 multiplied by there. You can just pause the video, take a look at that, and see it come out. So these come out and go all the way up here into this cross product, which delivers my central normal map. And I have a control which controls between just a pure blue, which is a flat normal, so basically no normal map at all, versus a normal map based off that height information. And these are going into some Fresnel nodes for the normals. The difference between these is one will just kind of do an overall fade around the edges, also a control for the fade in the center. So I have one that fades the center and one that fades the edges. And they have individual controls for their exponent, so we can control the fall off for the Fresnel. If you're not familiar with Fresnel, you can look that up. Fresnel basically just goes from the faces facing away from you towards the inwards. And with this normal map, it controls the different areas that have been applied to it. So without it, it does it like the sphere doesn't have any displacement, and with it, it pays attention to the fact that the displacement is there. So you can use that to control at your whim. The breakup, I tend to use a little added bit of the normals when I go to a larger scale texture, but I remove it when I go to the candle. So those two values are then added together. We also have something to control the tip. So I'm masking off the green, so it's using the texture. This is actually not a great way of doing this, and I'm going to probably reproduce it in a different way. But I essentially put this in for the candle, which I'm always using a sphere for anyways. It's not going to work properly for anything like the campfire version, so it doesn't work for this one. I used a different method for that already. So you can come up with a different solution for this. And this feeds into my fire coloring. So I've got a fire glow value, something to control my blue value, and something to control some additional redness. So to give you a basic overview of what's happening here, is the main stuff is going into a black body, and that's being fed out, and I'm masking the red, green, and blue individually. And in the red, I'm taking the initial Fresnel information, and I'm then lerping between it and an inverted version of this information to add more redness in the area that isn't currently bright and yellow. So it's trying to add redness to the edges is basically what it is. This, on the other hand, is coming off of this tip information. So again, I have to come up with a better way of accomplishing this, but I've got a power to control its overall fall off, and a multiply node is being applied to sharpen it and then clamp back to 0 to 1, and it's adding some blue or not adding some blue to it. And I haven't put in my parameter in here to control between having the blue and not, but it looks like I didn't need to, simply because when I adjust this by adjusting just the power, it controls the height of that fall off, and it usually ends up going very low below the area that's currently visible, so I didn't have to worry about it. But that's something that you could adjust if you wanted to put it in there. And once all these things are together, so this subtract is coming from the redness information, because I have to delete the redness in order to apply the blue, otherwise it turns purple. So that's in here just to delete the red area, but then I can do that. And that goes into the emissive color. And the original information off of here, which is the combination of the tip information plus the other Fresnel information, goes into overall opacity. The Fresnel information also has the fire mask information in there. And then the fire mask by itself goes into a series of displacements. So again, we're using world position and vertex normal position, and I'm blending between one or the other. So I can use a little bit of world position with what I'm doing is I'm masking off the different red, green, and blue values and controlling that through some different lerp functions. You can see how those are connected. If I move that around. Just move those around so that you can see how they're plugged in, because it's kind of spaghetti in here. All through there. And then an overall displacement value and a multiplier going into my tessellation and then my world displacement. And then I have this additional flicker texture, and my flicker texture is just a series of different width horizontal lines which I've run through this setup. Control the speed of the flicker and the overall scale of the texture. The larger the size, the bigger the flicker region is, and so I can control that. And yeah, so that's the texture right there. It's just a series of different width horizontal lines to give a feeling of variation. So that's the basic idea of how this was put together, and maybe you can come up with something a bit more efficient than what I've got here, but I got lots of variety of options, and it was a fair bit of fun just trying to figure out how to do it. So still a few more problems to figure out. I want to redo this a different way. I think I'm going to run this through my current texture and use maybe like a power node to control the fall off a second time, so that I get just the peaks of it, and I think that'll give me like the highest points, which is one of the areas that I want to be able to fade off so that I get the tips. So maybe that'll work. I'll try that a little bit later. Anyways, hope this was kind of interesting. Again, go back and you can pause at any given point in time to see how this whole thing was put together and try and troubleshoot your way through it.